view of, before we jump into projects and into the financing, we need to invest upstream in technology, in governance capacities and capabilities below the national and below the state levels in most countries. And we need to make sure that these partnerships occur across financing institutions. Today, the sophistication with which infrastructure financing is viewed deters large numbers of, to use a bad word, smaller governments. They feel deterred, they feel daunted, and they cannot think about taking on these projects and more or less forget about sustaining. Putting them in place is one challenge, and I, having lived through the Delhi power privatization, actually seen it happening before my eyes, remember how even for a city like Delhi and its government, which was, I would imagine, one of the best equipped to handle it, the process was daunting. We don't seem to have moved very much forward because not many other cities have taken on similar exercises on power privatization. Leave alone break them into smaller pieces of, as I said, distributed generation, smart metering, grid access to renewables. There are, I mean, you can name a large number which are really not the grist for conversations on quality infrastructure or on financing. But the other part which I am also placing for your consideration is that in setting standards for quality infrastructure, there should be no distinction between what we call rural or urban, or what is good for a village is not good for an urban, what is good for private is not good for public. That is where the biggest challenge lies, which is in standard setting for quality infrastructure, which will stand the test of environment as well as that of access, and will provide sustained access over a large period of time to the largest number of people across the largest number of areas. Now, I know that these are all very difficult for the very reason that I have brought this discordant note in this harmonious orchestra of financing in public, because I think just like we are moving on to the Industrial Revolution 4.0, we need to get a jump across the discourse that has been centered for the last decade on both infrastructure and in financing. And we need to move into issues relating to access, issues relating to inclusiveness, and issues relating to long-term sustainability of the infrastructure that we are providing. In terms of what we did 70 years ago, we were very good at it, as I said, whether it was big projects or big dams or big steel plants, but they have aged. And this is only an aside to take up from what Pratap said about brownfield. Most of these projects have land which is huge amounts in excess of what they ever used then or what they will ever use now. However, there are always roadblocks whenever they try to, these entities try to monetize their assets, because they are not allowed use of those assets. On an anecdotal note, the Jharkhand High Court is built on land which was acquired for the Heavy Engineering Corporation, which closed down. Because land acquisition is a problem, I am asking that we move our focus into projects which require less land, which provide more services, and which will become more easy to handle by the agencies and entities that are in charge of them. Yes, we will all need to pay for it. Nothing comes for free. So that payment will either be by taxation or by private funding. Either way, I mean, unlike what we believe in Delhi that, power and water come for free, they don't. Ultimately, someone somewhere is paying for them. So we are looking at great challenges here of trying to tailor this discourse on quality infrastructure to sectors which I believe, certainly, are most critical going forward, which are sectors which will make the future populations more capable and their capacities stronger and our world a better place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sindhishri, especially for moving us to the inclusive growth part of the title and focusing and bringing focus to issues of local community infrastructure, whether it's in urban or rural settings, and the somewhat different range of issues that one has to grapple with if one is talking about smaller projects or distributed systems and so forth. And as you rightly pointed out, I'm sure, that the quality of local governance here is a huge challenge in our country. Everybody thinks of government as either being at the central government level or at the state government level, but we've not really been very successful in empowering our third tier. And I suspect that is going to be at the heart of many of these other issues of technology and so forth that you outlined. Well, with that, I think we have about 15 minutes left for questions and interactions. And if you can, when I turn to you, if you could just mention who you are and who your question is principally addressed to. Gentleman over there.
My name is Yogesh, and my question goes to Professor Nishizawa. Thank you for an excellent presentation. You mentioned in your presentation that debt-fueled investment may, result in diminishing returns. And you gave an example of how it needs to be well thought out. You started with 2 case studies, the first being Delhi Metro. If you could give some insights on how has this project been from a funding perspective? Was it a debt investment done through JBIC as you were involved with it? And how has it been as one of the examples that you set up, saying that it's a case study of how infrastructure can be put up?
We'll take a few questions. So, lady at the back.
My name is Nandini. I'd like to ask that, the PPP model has been a success so far in India, and just draw a comparison with the US. In the US, they are too much pro PPP, or completely privatization, and India is somehow heading towards something like that. And the present trend is such. Well, my question is to Pratap ji especially, is that as far as accountability is concerned, how do you ensure, how can accountability be ensured, especially privatization or PPP in railways? Because there has been instances in the recent past that it has been given to, contractualized, and therefore there was some error in the railway track, and it resulted in the loss of lives. And that was a private, completely it was taken over by a private entity. So how do you ensure accountability, and what measures are you thinking of, taking for accountability, especially where there is a privatization?
My name is B.K.P. Sinha. I am from MIT University, School of Natural Resources and Sustainable Development. I would like to draw the attention of the respectable speakers on resilience against natural disasters. Madam has rightly said that, while we are, making a plan for infrastructure like roads or buildings or bridges, we forget about the basic life support systems. For example, we are encroaching on the life floodplain. All the water bodies have gone. So, there is a need for earmarking some funds for conservation of those which we have got, green areas. So, there is a need, and also there is a need. I would like that we should measure the efficiency in terms of the risk also. Risk should also, environmental risk should also be taken into consideration, not only the efficiency in terms of money. Whatever is the return divided by the environmental risks. So that should be the efficiency of measuring any infrastructure projects.
My name is Daljit Singh. I work for the Center for Energy, Environment and Resources. My question is to Mr. Pratap. You mentioned the success of the Delhi privatization, and I agree with you. It's been a great success. Savings, plus I think the service quality has really gone up tremendously. But why has there been, and this is the point that Mrs. Khuller brought up, why has there been no effort after that? And people know, the governments know, this government, and I'm talking about even the coming government, which is, I think, going to be essentially the same, that the governments know that distribution is a major problem. And they're trying all kinds of things about separation of carriage and content, this, that, and the other, but not about privatization. And what is this government going to do to make it easier?
Question is addressed for Mr. Pratap. You haven't addressed.
Arvind, you have to identify yourself.
You haven't. My name is Arvind Kumar, and I was associated with Ministry of Shipping and Road Transport. Mr. Pratap, you haven't referred to stranded assets in road and port sector. And here I would like to make one or two observations. I think PPP is a good model, but the problem is the incentive structure we have built in. Like the winning bid is the person who offers the highest premium, and in most of the cases it turns into a winner's curse. In case of port sector, where some of the investors have quoted 60% revenue share, that out of 100 rupees you earn, 60 rupees you will give to the port authority, and that is not built into the tariff calculation. Now I come to road sector. You see, in road sector, many of these bidders, they had different models, and some of the winning bids were based on 15 to 20% traffic growth, which even at that time was suspect. So I think that if you want to reform the PPP model, you have to have a different parameter, like in Europe and many other countries. It is not, it doesn't go to the highest bidder. It goes to the person who offers the highest investment plus other parameters. And one last point, you see, the Kelkar committee made a very good suggestion. That was a tribunal to adjudicate on these stranded assets in roads and other infrastructure. Nothing, we haven't heard anything on it.
Okay, I think we have enough, five sets of questions. So as I heard it, 3 of them were addressed to you, Pratap. So I'm going to turn to you first and hear from you.
On the issue of accountability, how do you enforce accountability of the private sector? That lies at the heart of a PPP. The key performance indicators that need to be enforced, they're part of the contract. In the road sector, we do not have an independent sectoral regulator, but we have regulation by contract. KPIs are a separate schedule which need to be enforced. Generally, it happens that the private sector takes the goodies, but when it comes to actual governance, when it comes to being accountable, there is a problem. And this is a fairly regular occurrence. In the case of Hyderabad Metro, we are currently grappling with the situation that the private concessionaire agreed on a certain amount of user charges, but for a variety of reasons, from day one, these user charges were increased by 70%. Obviously, we have stopped the viability gap funding for that project, but then that's a problem area. But as long as we can enforce contracts, some of these concerns can be taken care of. On the spreading of the PPP model beyond Delhi, power distribution, there is a loss per unit of electricity supplied in the country. This loss has come down lately, but we're still talking of 50 paise per unit of power. So if you want the private sector, tariffs would have to increase. There would be a need for hard decisions, and the government of Delhi, at the point of privatization, took a number of hard decisions, including negotiating with the prospective bidders. There was full political support for this, and I'm sure Madam will know much more. But then that's an area, like if you want to spread this model, the politicians and the bureaucrats have to be okay with that, in the sense that a number of hard decisions would have to be taken. We all know what the problems are. Nobody wants to bite the bullet. On the third aspect of stranded assets, aggressive bidding. Now you need to enforce the contracts. You need to allow some of these projects to fail. When it comes to, say, a Tata Mundra project in coastal Gujarat, which was aggressively bid, ₹2.26 per unit of power, but Tata's claim the rules have changed, but you need to enforce the contracts. If it happens that it cannot be honored because of the aggressive bidding, you need to allow these companies to go bankrupt. That will change the behavior of bidding. The model generally followed, and I'm not putting the entire blame on the private sector, is to bid low, get the contract and renegotiate later. We in the Ministry of Finance are very clear that is a perverse way of going about it. We do not want to go the Latin American way on renegotiations. We want to curb aggressive bidding, make it more realistic so that these situations do not happen. On the tribunals, there's the Specific Relief Act. It was amended in 2018. And as a part of that amendment, the state governments had, and the judiciary had to create special courts for administering these, for special tribunals for infrastructure contracts. We're trying to remind the states to enforce that, the efforts around. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Nishizawa, there was one about the Delhi Metro.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, first of all, what I meant by debt filled investment may lead to the problematic situation is not focusing on a particular project. What I meant is, for example, sector as a whole, or a country as a whole, without better planning, coordination, maybe the marginal, the project at margin might be a very, very unproductive with negative return. So I'm not sure whether I'm answering your question, but maybe that I was not clear enough about my statement in my presentation. For example, actually I'm very much, the PPP is one of my favorite subjects. And following up on India, Philippines, all the countries, highway project in India, there was kind of boom. National highways. Several years ago, PPP was introduced. There was a boom. But perhaps too many investment, too many projects. The marginal ones were not successful. So that kind of overall, looking at the sector or the country as a whole, that field, or if the funding is easily available, the marginal, at the margin, some of the project might be quite unproductive, ending up with negative return. That is what they meant.
I think the question was that Delhi Metro was the first dominant metro project in the
Yes.
country, and the news came out that the tariffs were increased a couple of times because it wasn't meeting the financial viability.
Yes.
And considering JBIG was one of the key bodies that funded that project, if you could give a perspective to enable that to be a learning so that the new projects that are coming up in multiple megapolis cities like Bangalore, Hyderabad, Ahmedabad, Pune, we could learn from the Delhi Metro project.
Oh, yes, yes. Price setting is always a case, always difficult. And there are many, many cases in the past because of the price setting was too optimistic, then ended up with some adjustment later on. So, well, I don't know why Delhi Metro price setting, initial price setting was not the right one, but there are many cases. We should learn that. Yeah. I always mention this at the end of my class on PPPs back in Tokyo. There's no such thing as a free lunch. Someone has to pay the cost, either users or taxpayers.
Thank you. Sindhishri, will you take the question from gentleman over there?
There was a question on the tanks and water bodies which are drying up because of large projects which have not taken that into consideration. In terms of greenfield projects, the environmental considerations always take prime position, and they are always looked at, and in the current regime of the land acquisition laws, in fact, that often delays the project is what some people argue. However, what is not taken into account, I would say, are two things. One is if these effects happen over a period of time, like water bodies drying up may happen because there's too much building construction, or as in the case of Chennai, a lot of the construction has come up on mangroves, or as in the case of Delhi, on the Yamuna floodplain. These things happen as urbanization proceeds or as the rural areas get built up. I have often felt that we need to look at some of these projects as infrastructure projects in themselves. For example, renovation, repair and construction of what in southern India are called tanks. Water bodies in a large number of cities or urbanizing areas in this country, and I'm sure this is the case in many other countries. That's exactly an extension of the kind of logic I was trying to build, which is that the discourse on quality infrastructure and on financing such quality infrastructure has to move away from the traditional comfortable sectors and needs to go deeper into closer to living areas, living spaces and living communities, where the air we breathe, the water that we have around us, and probably the ecosystem that we are going to bequeath to the next generation should be of a certain quality as well. That should be taken into account, you're right, but I do submit for the consideration of my colleagues on the panel that they are projects in themselves, and I don't see why not. I remember that a few years ago there was a question raised at the highest level as to how many reservoirs are there in the big dams which were built in the first decade of development in India. It's not surprising that there was no one keeping tabs, because once they were built, their operation and maintenance went to several different bodies. Hence the governance deficit. No one knew how much water to release from which dam and when, and which reservoirs needed to be repaired, reconstructed, renovated. Now, if you try and projectize these, they will become financing possibilities in themselves. But it needs a greater and more expert discourse on all this. And just a minor comment on the Delhi Metro. Even at the time that it was conceived in The first line was inaugurated in 2002, I think. The fare box collection was never intended to meet the deficit. Typically, Pratap will tell us better, typically in a transportation project, the fare box collection meets anywhere between 15 to 20% if you are ambitious of the cost. What happens in most of these projects is that the project construction and the operations get linked together. And it's also managed by the same agency. Whereas the financing, particularly say JBIC loans or any other loans, is mainly for the construction, not for the operation. Construction and the hardware, and that's not the right word, but for the coaches and such like, tracks and coaches and signaling. Whereas the operation and maintenance cost, which is a recurring cost, is one part of it.
Thank you. Well, first of all, my thanks to all the panelists for their presentations as well as for engaging with the questions very effectively. I'm afraid we're out of time, sorry. Thanks to the audience for participating actively. And Rajat, I think despite starting a little late, we're not too late ending. We're just 5 minutes over, so coffee break, I suppose.
Thank you, panelists. Now we break for coffee, and we'll be back at 11:15 for the session on climate financing for sustainable growth. Thank you.